Welcome to DMNL on this very hot Tuesday morning, and thank you all for coming out. Anybody who's still wearing jackets, then please do feel free to remove your jacket. We don't want anybody passing out. And also, can I just remind members that even though we don't have any planning applications before us, we are still live streaming, and so can you please make sure you use your microphones when you speak, please, as it gets picked up. And if you can just put any exterior devices onto mute, that would be very, very helpful. Thank you very much indeed. So we will go straight to the agenda. Item 1, apologies. Do we have any?
Thank you, Chair. We have apologies from Councillor Pierce, and Councillor Cheadle is substituting for him. Thank you.
Lovely, thank you. Item 2 is declaration of interest. Do members have any interest to declare? Yep, okay, lovely, thank you. Item 3 is items requiring urgent attention. There aren't any at this time. Item 4, confirmation of the minutes. This is of the meeting held on the 14th of June and can be found between pages 1 and 4 on your agenda. Everybody happy I sign them as a true and accurate record? Lovely, thanks.
Sorry, if I could just ask, Chair, my understanding was that the minutes were going to reflect the full conditions of a planning application.
So let me just
I'm looking at page 3 of the minutes.
Okay. 2. Page 3. When you say, because the actual recommendation is conditional consent and it has the conditions above that.
I'm sorry, I was skipping down too far. My apologies.
Okay, so you're happy that they, okay. So we've, everybody's happy, no other issues. Lovely, thank you. I'll just sign these a minute. Okay, so item 5 is the Hackney carriage and private hire policy, which is monthly, and this is found between pages of 5 and 114 on your agenda. And I would like to hand over to Mr. Staples. So thank you, over to you.
Thank you, Chair. As the Chair has already pointed out, this is a agenda report dealing with some proposed updates to the taxi policy. The updates are in relation to some statutory standards that were published by the Department of Transport in July 2020. The background to these standards are that we had multiple different reports to different government committees over a number of years seeking to make updates to the way that taxi trade, and by term taxi I mean private hire and hackney carriage, and I'll use that term throughout, but the way that the taxi trade is regulated. So we had a law commission report, I think in 2010. We had several parliamentary working groups, and all of them made good, sensible suggestions all around kind of protecting public safety. And all of them, reports went in, and then effectively nothing else happened. And we had a gap of a couple of years, basically, until a parliamentary working group that was in sort of January 2019. And then out of nowhere, almost, sort of 6-8 months after they finished their report, we got these statutory standards that came through. So effectively, the status of these standards is that a local council has to have a really compelling reason not to follow them. So the intention of the Department for Transport is to effectively try to standardise the regulation of taxis across the country. Now, that doesn't stop you from having locally focused elements of your policy and things like vehicle standards and tailoring it to meet local needs. The key public safety elements of the policy should reflect the statutory standards unless there's a really compelling reason not to. So what we've done here is we've effectively compared the previous policy, which in the case of West Devon was a really good quality modern policy, last reviewed in 2018, with many really good, sort of elements of work in there. Things like that you already had a subscription to the disclosure and borrowing service update service. So effectively, all of the drivers that were licensed by West Devon have an up-to-date criminal record check that they can disclose whenever it's required. And that's a really good innovation. Very few councils had that prior to statutory standards coming in. But because your policy was reasonably up to date, you already had it. So that would have been one of the major pieces of work for the licensing team, actually. So you had a pretty modern, pretty up-together policy already. What we've done is effectively kind of a gap analysis where we've looked at what the standards are saying and what your policy is saying, and we've suggested updates to the policy to align that with the statutory standards. Some of the big changes with this would be some additional requirements for private hire operators in particular, and there's some additional record keeping requirements that they would have to fulfil. There would also be some additional requirements for them in respect of having criminal record checks for their staff, which may seem a slightly abstract thing. The driver of the vehicle is in that direct kind of contact with the passenger, and the link between the driver being a safe and suitable individual there is clearer. But the standards set out how, if you're an operator at a sort of private hire company, you're in receipt of potentially a lot of very sensitive information, and the standards have asked for those individuals to have a basic criminal record check, so that we know that there isn't an element of criminality with people getting hold of that information without being checked first, basically. So those elements. The other main change to the policy would be some further alignment of the relevance of conviction sections of the policy. So these are where you set out the framework for if someone has certain previous convictions, how many years you would feel that would be acceptable for that to have elapsed before you would consider them a suitable individual to hold a driver's license. So if you look through that section in particular, you will see that that's been aligned with the Institute of Licensing's model standards, which the Department of Transport Standards advocate. And you would see that in many instances across the standard, the difference is that the number of years has increased between the conviction and when the driver would be considered suitable, basically. So we've increased the level of protection of that in the proposal that we're making here. So just to move on to the recommendations themselves. So the recommendation here is that yourselves, the committee, note the contents of the Department of Transport taxi and private hire standards, and that you consider the following proposed changes to the Hackney Carriage and private hire policy. So Appendix A is, as the chair points out, this is an amendment to align the Hackney Carriage private hire licensing criminal convictions policy with the Institute of Licensing's guidance on determining suitability of applicants. You see the terminology and the language in that document has changed. It's hardened over time, basically. So you're talking, it puts forward a test of the suitability of an individual, which I think is really helpful to a committee if you've got a fit proper hearing in front of you. That applications are reviewed against the National Register of Revocations and Refusals. By way of an update there, we now have some primary legislation that's going to make it a requirement that licensing authorities sign up to a national register like this. So effectively, when we get a new applicant for a taxi license, we would put their details into the national database when it's fully formed and working. And it would show us if they've previously been refused a license, been revoked or suspended by another authority. We would then be in a position to contact that authority and request the relevant information, and they wouldn't have the issues with data protection we do now, because effectively the primary legislation gives them that authority to disclose the information. So it would really speed things up actually as well. We already have a section on the application form which asks prospective drivers if they've been licensed elsewhere, and we would routinely make contact with those authorities. But if there's anything that if they give us an indication that there are any previous history of that driver that would be irrelevant, we would have to do a data protection request, and it can take some weeks basically to get that information basically from them. So this will be quite helpful to us. It will involve a bit of a admin exercise from the licensing team in populating that list from West Devon's point of view with previous drivers that have been revoked and refused, because we have to go back, I believe, 11 years to the guidance right now. So that will be a bit of an admin exercise, but we feel it will be a useful tool for us going forward once we've completed that. there is a referral to the barred list where an individual is thought to present a risk of harm to child or vulnerable adult. I believe that would be something that would always have happened over many years in the authority, but it wasn't explicitly stated in the policy. So actually what we're doing is formalising what we would have done anyway there. There is the introduction of a requirement for a tax conditionality check as part of the application process. This came in April. We have to, so everybody that applies for a license or renewal has to give us a tax code that proves their registered premises. Essentially, the taxi industry was identified by HMRC as being a bit of a grey industry potentially for the paying of taxes. Basically, so they introduced legislation by the Finance Act last year to close off and make that requirement. We have an amendment to the notification period for licence holders. Applicants can notify the licensing authority of arrest, conviction or caution. That's reduced from 5 days to 48 hours in line with the statutory guidance. There is an introduction of a requirement for vehicle proprietors to provide a DBS certificate as part of the application process. In almost all circumstances, basically in West Devon, the person that is applying for a vehicle licence is also a licensed driver, but there may be occasional instances where somebody just runs a fleet of vehicles and doesn't necessarily drive themselves, and that covers that off. There's the introduction of a mandatory requirement to display a house complaint sticker within the vehicles, and we've drafted copies of that, and we have a supplier lined up if you're in agreement to use that. And an introduction of a requirement from the 1st of January 2023 for private hire operators to obtain a basic DBS disclosure certificate for all controllers, as I mentioned. So that would be call handlers and dispatching staff. And they also have to have a written policy on employing ex-offenders. And lastly, that the introduction of additional record keeping requirements for private hire operators, so they have to have details of who's dispatched the vehicle, who's at call, etc. as well, and on their existing records. That would come into effect on the 1st of January. And the reason to give a gap there is to give them a period of time in order to make any software changes, to change any changes in practice, practically, and test that prior to the policy requirement coming in and being held over them. And we have the third and the final recommendation is that the committee recommends to the council that the draft carriage and private hire policy as amended is adopted at the meeting on the 27th of September. I'm happy to, Appendix B summarises that gap analysis between the existing policy and what we've proposed. I'm happy to take any questions that members may have. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Staples, very comprehensive. Councillor Moyes, please.
Yes, under 3.7, there's a standard length of 3 years for taxi and private hire vehicle drivers, and 5 years for private hire vehicle operators. I would have thought it may have been the other way around, but could you explain it, please?
Thanks, Councillor. Yes, 3 years is the standard length of licence for a driver. Councillors have the option to provide a shorter licence. 5 years is in the legislation is the standard length of time for private hire operator licence. I don't know what the thinking was legislatively, why that was put in place, but it's been in place for a number of years, that element, and it has worked without difficulty for the department up to now.
Councillor Cheadle.
Thank you. I've got a couple of questions about sort of communications. One is, have we done any consultation between us and the sort of taxi driving community about these changes and the implications of them? And secondly, on the assumption that we agree this paper today, is there a plan to communicate to the sort of public at large the additional protections that are afforded by our new policy?
Thank you, Councillor. There have been a number of informal discussions with representatives of the taxi trade in West Devon. This is something that's been trailed widely in the taxi press. There is a trade publication. There have been reference to this, I believe, in at least 2 newsletters as well. And we are looking to include the most recent changes around the safeguarding legislation, and we have some further legislative changes around the Equality Act as well, with their additional duties. So again, we're looking to update those via the use of newsletters to trade. The idea of publicising this to the public, absolutely, we would be happy to draft a press release to that effect. We haven't undertaken that as yet, but if the committee were agreeable to the changes to the policy, we'd be happy to draft something and look to get that out as a press release.
Unless I've misinterpreted what the paper was saying, there's a strengthening of the sort of whistleblowing such that someone is something else happening in a taxi. The council, we are sort of here to listen to customers' concerns and experiences, and that's strengthened by this paper, I think.
Yes, I mean the opening section of the statutory guidance talks about public safety being at the core of this, actually, and the measures that they're proposing, as I say, for West Devon, actually, the number of changes to the policy are fairly small compared to many councils. And for a lot of councils, this would be quite a big and onerous job to update the policy to this extent, because it compared to previous versions of the same guidance, which I've worked under, this was a step change, actually, in the requirements that they're looking for, basically, and for the councils to really be robust in their regulation. In particular, I think it's extremely helpful in the framework that they have given us for determining whether somebody is suitable in the first instance. You're probably all aware of cases that have been in the national news over the last few years with taxi drivers that have done appalling things. And like any industry, that is, a very, very tiny minority of taxi drivers. Most are very, diligent and helpful individuals. But it's going to really strengthen the regulation across the country, basically, to try and reduce the possibility of those very rare incidents occurring any further, actually, I would say, with this. Coming back to your point with respect to consultation, we haven't recommended a public consultation here because effectively we're required to undertake these changes unless we have a really strong reason to do so. So we would normally, with policy changes, look to have a public consultation to get that engagement. But here, the feeling is from officers is that we haven't got as much remit here anyway with the changes. We have to make certain changes to the policy anyway. So that was the rationale behind that. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. Within the document, there's all the regulation around drivers. If they are caught speeding by the police, I assume you get informed about that. And does that affect their driving license and their license at all?
Yes, so there would be a requirement that they would notify us if they've been convicted of speeding. Yes, and it could potentially affect their license. So an accumulation of points under the policy would mean that they would likely be referred to a licensing subcommittee for a determination as to whether they remain fit under the policy. Now, as a committee, there would be a number of potential avenues that you may wish to pursue there. You may take the view that the driver is no longer suitable if the number of points is accumulated to that extent. You may wish to refer them to a driving course. So we have an existing relationship with a driving test centre on the outskirts of Exeter. It's run by the Fire Brigade Service, and it's based around assessing somebody on a normal driving route, and then the instructor providing feedback, and then they would then do some further driving. We've used that successfully previously with drivers that have had problems with their driving in particular, and they found that the feedback was very good for that as an approach. So it's something that it would affect their licence and may involve them being put before a committee. But there are vocational means to deal with that as well as disciplinary means.
Following on from that, I'm the coordinator for Speedwatch in West Devon. This last week, we have recorded a taxi in excess of 48 mile an hour in a 40 zone, and a school bus in excess of 47 in a 40 zone. Speedwatch doesn't prosecute, but do you get that information coming through? Can it be used against that person? Because they are listed as vehicles of interest when we report them.
I don't believe we get that information at the moment. The way the policy is written, it'd be a requirement if they've been awarded is the wrong word, but given points on their license, they would have to notify the authority. But I don't believe they would if it was any other type of scheme where they would get a notification that they've sped outside of having penalty points as it stands at the moment.
It was just that the police actually require us to note them as a vehicle of interest, and I'm just wondering whether that is fed through from the police.
Yeah, we don't get that information at the moment. I mean, that would be very useful to us, and we would be happy to have a conversation with those drivers, because that to me is a really good example of an occasion where the driver might be invited to come in and have an interview with licensing officers about their driving conduct, and effectively they would then get a written warning on their file, depending on the speed involved, or it may be a case that we would even refer that to a committee. So if they were doing, 48 miles an hour is, a fair speeding offence, basically, if it was the police. So they'd likely be looking at sort of 6 points, not, 3 points for that sort of offence. So that would immediately put them in the territory that would be a referral to committee. So we would look at each case on its merits, but that would be very valuable intelligence to us, actually.
I think possibly this might be something that would be best taken up outside the meetings that's very specific to the Speedwatch, which is not sort of part of the policy. So perhaps I can leave you to take that one up, particularly with Mr. Staples outside the meeting. Okay.
It's because if we actually report to the police, and the police, I just wonder whether the police feed that through.
Yes, no, I appreciate that. As I didn't want to do anything that could potentially identify anybody to come out. Any other questions, members? Councillor.
Thank you, Chair, and Mr. Staples. I understand the checking of vehicles. That's an isolated thing which is factual when it happens, but the documentation which a driver would hold, and are there provisions for the authority being us, to have random spot checks of all of the relevant documents? I've seen cases, or I've heard of cases where perhaps MOT is out of date, or insurance and different things. And I would imagine they would all be checked when the license is renewed. But my concern is mid-term and perhaps a totally at random spot checking. Is there provision within this for an authority to do that?
Thank you. We have got the ability, we have got powers to check those documents. It's not something we currently do. We do undertake checks on the driver's license itself, so we can do a group check of all of our drivers to see if anybody has accumulated points, which is a really helpful piece of software, actually. As you've mentioned, we do check these documents at renewal, and they're required to be within 3 months of the renewal date when we effect the renewal as well. So we do that. And we are planning to do some further enforcement checks as well, so actually be out and about in some evenings, basically undertaking some checks of the vehicles themselves, and we'll be able to check some documents there as well. But no, we haven't at recent times been undertaking those checks mid-term of the licence. We would love to do more regulatory checks like that. That would be really helpful. We do get occasionally reports of vehicles that are defective, basically, and we have powers as well to suspend vehicles where we identify defects on vehicles as well. For example, when I've had experience in my career in inspecting vehicles on the rank, and I've served immediate suspension notices for defective lighting, bold tyres. One of the problems with the trade on occasion is that nobody wants to take responsibility for taking the car to the garage, because that's time when you're off the road and not earning, actually. So that can be more of a problem in more urban areas where you get less sharing vehicles. So in certain urban areas, you'll get a daytime driver and a nighttime driver, and that can be more of a problem there with the vehicle in use most of the day and evening. Districts like West Devon, the issue is more around the wear and tear on the vehicles from the road network, basically, rather than excessive mileage, as you get in some other authorities. But we would love to do some more checks like that.
Thank you. Yes, it is encouraging then that you, with your spot checks you're doing, you could include, and I would encourage that possibly we do all of the documentation, even if you have to bring it down or give you site or whatever it is, because I think this is something that worries me, is that the vehicle is covered, but it's not the documentation which goes with that we're going to do. But I would encourage you to do that. Thank you.
Any other questions, members? Okay, in which case then, I will move the recommendations as very ably described, which could be on page 5 and page 6 of your agenda. In the absence of the Vice Chair, is there a seconder, please? An awful lot. Okay, thank you. Members, we are now in debate. Do you wish to speak? I think essentially we have a very comprehensive report, which is any questions we have, most of them been answered within the report, and because it's predominantly bringing it in line with statutory requirements, so if nobody's got anything, we will go straight to the vote. So all those in favour, please show. It's unanimous. Okay, thank you very much, and thank you, Mr. Staples, and that is probably the shortest development management meeting we have ever had. So thank you all very much indeed, and I declare the meeting closed.